The Blue Beetle, A Confession by A.G. Gray, Jr. Day after day and night after night did I brood over the great discovery which I thought was about to be opened up to me. I had long had a belief in the progressive development of creation. I believed that it was still possible to find the speck, the germ from which I could raise up a perfectly organised living being. I felt a new and strange pleasure in believing that the mystery of creation was now solved, that from the first inorganic atom which had received the force of life, all other created beings had slowly, gradually, and regularly advanced up to the period in which I lived. The power of creation, the secret of life, was my goal. My belief was that the force of life might be given to this inorganic atom. My books were those of the alchemists. With what wild delight I hailed the writings of Geber, of Albertus Magnus, of Arnaud de Villeneuve, Heidenberg of Trondheim, Raymond Lully, and Bernard of Treves. I believed in the alchemists. I struggled through the intricacies of their hidden language. Their experiments in search of gold I passed over, wonderful as they were, and strangely, as they opened my mind to the real truth. I repeated all their experiments on life force, and substantiated every fact I read. My laboratory was perfectly furnished. My days were spent there, and often entire nights. My mind was absorbed in the great truth I was bringing to light. The confined air of my laboratory at length affected my health. A change was absolutely necessary. I struggled against the idea of removing for some time, and often left my little wife with the tears standing in her deep blue eyes after she had unsuccessfully implored me to leave London for a short while. Dear Annie, and how I loved her. Heavens, to think that But I must proceed with my story as it occurred. We went to the north of Northumberland to stay with my old friend Charles, who had frequently asked us to come on previous occasions. We were received warmly, and as it was winter time, we had plenty of occupation. A few brisk runs with the county foxhounds almost made me forget my laboratory. The weather at length changed, first to severe frost with snow, and then to a complete thaw. The dismal north-east wind shrieked through the leafless trees and drove torrents of sleet splashing against the old-fashioned windows. Tired of hoping and weary of grumbling, I was driven to take refuge in Charles's library. After a long search for something interesting, I came upon a little brown volume bound with two dingy metal clasps. On opening its dark and discoloured pages, I found that it was written in French manuscript. A hurried glance showed me that the work was on alchemy, a translation from the Arabic. All my former hopes returned in an instant. I pored over the pages of my newly obtained treasure till late on in the evening, heedless of the impatience of my friends, who, after several useless attempts to draw me away, at last left me to my book and self. The secret, then, was now mine. Here, in this old neglected book, I had found a groundwork for my exertions. All the truths I had collected, all the experiments I had made, bore me out. I saw what had prevented others, in ancient times, from carrying out their designs. They knew not the life-giving power. The wonders of electricity had not then been discovered. Vaguely hinted at and darkly guessed at in their works, I saw them groping their way in mist and uncertainty. But I was surrounded by the light of science. Wonderful, mysterious truths broke upon my mind. My whole method and plan of operations stood out clearly before me. A resistless force urged me to commence my scheme instantly. I must leave for London that very night. I found my wife and friends retiring to rest. I told them my intention of starting for town immediately. Remonstrance and entreaty were of no avail, and in less than an hour I had reached the train at the neighbouring railway station, and was hastening through the stormy night towards London. The train seemed to drag slowly through the darkness, but about noon next day I arrived at my house. Without rest I commenced my operations. Late at night I had nearly completed them, and worn out in body and mind, I threw myself on the floor to sleep, lulled by the subdued sound of my furnace, which moaned and muttered like an unhappy spirit. Early in the morning, after a feverish sleep, I rose tired and unrefreshed, and began to complete the last portion of my arrangements. This was to prepare the liquid from which the beings to whom I had to impart life were to spring. On account of the experiments made in my late studies, I had all the ingredients ready in my laboratory. I poured the mixture carefully into a large silver trough. The liquid was perfectly limpid and of a beautiful blue colour, probably on account of a salt of copper entering largely into its composition. And now I prepared my batteries, and soon afterwards the electric agent was applied. To my astonishment, no decomposition took place. The liquid remained clear and beautifully blue. Thus it remained for some hours. I hung over it in breathless expectation, the only change apparently being that the colour seemed deeper and purer. Night came on, and the electric fluid still quietly streamed into the liquid. By accident, in adjusting one of the wires, I dashed a few drops from the trough onto the floor. There was a hissing sound as they fell, and as they touched the ground they burst into flame. This I extinguished, and then applied myself to observing closely the contents of the vessel, for I knew that a great change had taken place in their constitution. I removed the light to a distance, fearing lest it should ignite the vapours which were now rising from the surface. On returning in the dark, I found strange flashes of light circling in the interior of the fluid. These gradually became brighter, till I was able to see every object in the room clearly by their radiance. Subtle fumes were also rising from the surface. On inhaling these fumes, at first I felt faint, but the sensation passed away. The perfume now was delicious. It was heavenly. I drank it in like nectar. I gazed upon the coruscating surface, and a delirious ecstasy seemed to pervade my whole being. Delicious streams of music fell softly on my ears, and shadowy forms of ineffable beauty floated in the air around me. Suddenly, an insane desire took possession of me. I longed to seize the silver vessel and quaff the deep blue poison. I stretched out my hands with a cry of joy, and then it was some days before I could get any explanation of how I came to be in my own bedroom. I recovered at last from a fever which had kept me insensible for a week, with my little wife attending to my every want, her little hands ever busy, and her eyes beaming with love and tenderness. Gradually, the details of my late occupation dawned upon my memory. I imagined I perceived the subtle odour diffusing itself through the chamber, and shuddered as I lay back on my pillow. A feeling of remorse came over me when I thought of my design. I felt as if I had intruded where man should fear to tread, and I felt a gratification in thinking that my designs had been frustrated. One morning, when the physician said I was able to bear the news, I was told that one of the domestics, hearing a scream on that fearful night, had forced open the door of the laboratory. A strange, overpowering perfume, he said, at first drove him back, but rushing in a second time, he found me lying, insensible, on the floor. With breathless eagerness, I asked if any of the apparatus in the room had been touched. No, nothing had been touched. The windows had been opened to allow the poisonous vapours to disperse, but the doors had then been locked and had never been opened since. A weight seemed removed from my mind. I would instantly go down and destroy all that remained of my strange experiment. But I was still too weak. 3 or 4 days passed over, and then I was able to go downstairs. With trembling hands and beating heart, why, I could not tell, I turned the key and entered the laboratory alone. Everything remained as I had left it a fortnight before. There stood the ponderous batteries, long since worked out. There loosely hung the copper connecting wires, covered with green rust. The silver trough was tarnished and dim, but everything stood as I had left it. The interior of the trough was coated with metallic copper, while the solution had almost entirely evaporated. There was still a small quantity of liquid at the bottom, covered with thick, opal-tinted mould. On looking closely at this mould-covered residue, I noticed a peculiar irregularity, or rather regularity, in its surface. There were 5 little heaps or hillocks in regular arrangement, one at each angle of a square and one in the centre, exactly like the number 5 of a gaming die. These heaps were of such equal size and uniform shape that I could not attribute their presence to chance. I supposed that electricity had so acted upon the particles of the solution so as to make them take up their present position. I examined the mould under the microscope and found it to be a fungus of a peculiar kind, but in removing some more of the mould with a glass rod, I happened to touch one of the little heaps and found under it a small blue crystal of cubic form, and under each of the other 3 angular hillocks I found a similar crystal. On removing the mould from the centre hillock, I found what at first I thought was a circular mass of the same crystalline substance, but imagine my surprise and horror when I saw the mass begin to struggle among the liquid, and clearing away the silky needles of the mould, disclosed to my view a large scarabaeus of perfect shape and of a deep blue transparent colour. A feeling of terror filled my mind. Whence had come this strange creature? Whence came the power with which he stretched out his antennae, drew the blue case covers from his back, and cleared the mould from his filmy wings? Could this be the result of my researches, my days of toil, my nights of unrest? A beetle? I strove to laugh, but the attempt failed, and my heart sank within me with a strange foreboding. At this moment, from the interior of the trough arose a peculiar sound, like the rapid ticking of a clock, although louder, and with a metallic tinkle in it. It was the same sound as that produced by the death-tick beetle. As soon as the sound died away, I looked once more at the creature. He was half in and half out of the liquid, and evidently as yet unable to fly. The prominent desire in my mind was to destroy the insect, for his unearthly sounds and the strange flashing of his bead-like eyes made me tremble with a vague terror. However, I overcame the feeling and determined to let him live for a few days. Early the next morning I visited the laboratory, but on looking into the silver vessel I was unable to detect any traces of the scarabaeus. Puzzled and annoyed, I began to inspect the room, when I suddenly heard the ominous death tick, and after a few preliminary flights round the room, the beetle alighted on the rim of the trough. A ray of sunlight glancing in fell upon him. His colour was exquisite, a rich, deep cerulean blue. He seemed a living sapphire, and would have been beautiful but for his loathsome form. I had brought a piece of sugar with me, which I thought might please the taste of my new favourite. I placed it on the bench near, and he flew directly towards it and settled upon it, but as if dissatisfied, a moment afterwards he flew back to the rim of the trough. I heard a low whine at my feet, and looking down saw my wife's little dog, Lalette. I threw the rejected sugar towards her, and soon heard her crunching it in her little jaws. Shortly afterwards I left the room, and as I closed the door, louder than ever, I heard the sound of the death tick. I was engaged out of doors during the day, and in the evening my wife's first question was whether I had seen Lalette that day. I then remembered that she had been in the laboratory with me in the morning, and fancying that she must be locked in, I went to the door and opened it, calling her by name. There was no movement or response, but as I called again, something whirled past me in the air and dashed out into the hall. I felt certain that my beetle had escaped. Shutting the door hastily, I rushed back for a light. On re-entering the laboratory, I could neither see nor hear anything of the beetle. But in the middle of the floor, exactly where I had left her in the morning, poor Lalette was lying dead. Some portions of the sugar were still lying beside her. Once more, before leaving, I sought diligently for the beetle, but no trace was to be found. Lalette was a great favourite, and my poor wife was inconsolable. I told her the dog must have picked up some poison in my room, and with promises of a new canine favourite, her grief soon calmed down. All that night, an indefinable horror took possession of me. When I thought of that living sapphire being at large in the house, a firm belief possessed me that Lalette had been killed by that poisonous insect. All that night it haunted my dreams. Several times I started from slumber, thinking I had heard that unearthly death tick. I determined, in my feverish sleeplessness, to search every nook and corner of the house on the morrow. Somehow I felt at times that my existence, my destiny, was bound up in the life of this hideous insect. Reproaches seemed spoken to me, in one dream of that long night, that I had created a living poison and sent it out into the world. I shuddered and awoke. The words seemed burnt upon my brain. Could I ever forget them? Next morning I heard that one of the domestics, a young pretty girl of 19 years, was ill. 3 days afterwards she died. The doctors said it was heart disease. One of them, a sententious old empiric, said the only peculiarity of the case was a strange mark upon the girl's breast. A pang shot through my whole frame. A mark? What mark? What was it like? By a mysterious perception, I knew that this mark concerned me. But how? I soon knew. On the cold white breast of the corpse were 5 blue spots, arranged like the spots on the 5 side of a die. Controlling my emotion as best I could, I locked myself in my own room, and burying my face in my hands, cried in agony, "Accursed beast, this is thy work. The blood of an innocent being is on my hands." My brain seemed whirling round, and every attempt to collect my thoughts was in vain. The infernal creature, my creature, had murdered this young girl, and how knew I where it would stop? One thing was plain. My wife and the whole household must be removed immediately. Seizing a pen, I wrote hurriedly to Charles, and explaining, as best I could, the unexplained visit of my wife, I went up to the station and saw her start by the first train to the north. The corpse of the young girl was removed by her friends in the afternoon, and the other servants were dispatched to their respective homes. I was left alone in the house all that long, lonely night. I waited in each room, listening for that fearful death tick. Never a lover waited more anxiously for a loving whisper from loved lips than I for that hideous sound. But, save the hushed murmur of the mighty city, and the clang of the slow hours as they passed, and the beating of my own heart, all was silence. I searched all that night, and the next day, and the next day, and the next, but no vestige of the loathsome creature could I find. On the fourth day came a letter from my wife. My friend Charles was ill. He was sinking fast and wished to see me. Locking up my house, not without some dread, I journeyed northward to Charles's house. As I drove up the long avenue in the afternoon, I thought the old mansion had a mournful gloom brooding over it. My heart was depressed. A presentiment of evil hung about me, and I could not cast it off. The tearful face of the servant who admitted me added to my mournful forebodings. I found Charles in bed, dying. The first glance showed me that his days were numbered. A sickly smile of welcome played over his features as I approached him, but it almost instantly changed for a look of intense suffering. I asked what the particular symptoms of his illness were, and the medical man in attendance tried to explain the malady, but left me painfully impressed with the idea that he was entirely ignorant of the disease. I had turned to speak to some of the family who were in the room, when I was startled by a piercing cry of agony from the bed. Charles was sitting up, his wan face distorted with pain. He was grasping his neck with his white, nervous hands. "My throat is on fire," he shrieked. "It burns! It burns! Water! For the love of heaven, a drop of water!" Trembling, I held a tumbler of water to his lips. He had scarcely tasted it when he dashed the glass from my hands to the floor, exclaiming, "Devil! I did not ask for vitriol! Give me water! Water!" As he said this, he tore open the neck of his dressing gown. Merciful heavens! Could I believe my eyes? There was the fatal mark. There, even among the purple distended veins which interlaced like strong cords around his neck, there I could see it. 5 blue spots, arranged like the fireside of a die. The room swam before my eyes, and the word murderer seemed ringing in my ears. When I recovered, Charles was dead. My agitation had been attributed to grief at my friend's death. No one had noticed the cursed mark but myself. The members of the family were absorbed in grief. My wife strove to soothe and solace them, but such work was not for me. I gave myself up to my own frightful reflections. The creature had then found his way to this remote place. How, I knew not, nor did I ever know. It was enough for me to know that it was there. My oldest, truest friend was dead, and a happy home had been rendered wretched, and through me, through this cursed creation of mine. Why had I not obeyed that first impulse, and killed it as it lay in the mould of the silver trough? I wandered out into the night. My mind was all in desolate confusion. It was a lovely night. The sky glimmered with stars, and the full moon rose as I walked with uneven steps under the trees. I threw myself down on the wet grass and wept like a child. Soon the soft shimmer of the moonlight broke out into full radiance and bathed the whole countryside in a flood of beautiful light. The gentleness of the scene after a time impressed me, and I became calmer and reflected on my position. If the creature is here, it must be hunted down. I dare not tell the household. There was guilt and blood on my conscience. They would deem me mad, I thought. Then, again, I thought that the excitement of the last few days, together with my late illness, might have produced the effect of an optical illusion, that there was no mark. This conviction strengthened, and I returned again to the house. The servant who opened the door started when he saw my altered appearance, my matted hair and wet, disorderly dress, but I asked calmly enough to be shown to the room where the body of Charles was lying. I went in alone. Need I tell you the result? The fearful mark was there, and stood out brightly against the cold, white skin. Every corner of the room I searched, but no trace of the fiendish beast was there. After some time spent in this vain search, I left the room, and gained my wife and her friends below. They were shocked at my changed appearance, and I sat apart, moody and silent. A heavy, suffocating cloud of presentiment overpowered me. I felt that my cup was not yet filled, but when filled, I should have to drink it to its bitter, bitter dregs. We separated to retire to rest, but though few of us expected to sleep, no sooner had I laid my head on the pillow than I fell fast asleep. A dull, heavy sleep, as dreamless and almost as breathless as that of the corpse in the next chamber. I do not know how long I had slept when I awoke suddenly with an unaccountable feeling of terror. How dark the room is getting. Put your ear closer to my mouth. I feel faint with speaking loud, but I must tell you all. I awoke, and seemingly close by my ear, loud and distinct, I heard the death tick. My hands clenched till the nails penetrated the flesh, when I knew he was within my reach, close by my ear. Heaven help me if I do not crush the creature now. The moonbeams poured in through the windows and filled the room with a mysterious light. The rays struck across the pillows of the bed and fell softly on the upturned face of my little wife. She slumbered peacefully, but on her snowy brow, glistening as blue as heaven itself, was the loathsome beetle. With one blow I struck him from her face, and then leapt from the bed. I saw his glittering jewel-like form upon the ground. I seized it and crushed it with my hands, and a fierce pain shot up my arm. My blood seemed changed to molten lead. The agony was excruciating, and I dropped to the vile abortion. He flew from me, and dashing through the glass of the window, disappeared into the moonlit night. My story is well nigh told. You know how my wife sickened and died. But listen, you did not see the blue mark upon her white brow. How dark the room is, and how slowly my heart is beating. Look at my arm, here, above the elbow. There is the death brand. 5 blue spots, arranged like the spots on a die. I have but an hour to live. You know my secret. Let me rest.